In the late summer of 1483, Henry Tudor received an unexpected visitor during his exile in Brittany. A man named Hugh Conway arrived on behalf of Tudor's mother, Margaret Beaufort. Carrying a considerable sum of money, he handed it over to the 26-year-old exile. He also brought a letter from the mother of the tall, somewhat lanky young man, a letter destined to change Henry's life forever. Margaret urged him to come to England and claim the crown, declaring that this was the only way her son could ever be truly safe. Shortly afterwards, a second letter reached him, this time from the Duke of Buckingham. Henry Stafford, once the most loyal ally of Richard III, had now defected and offered Henry a marriage alliance with Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV. The proposed marriage spoke for itself. Richard III, the messengers assured him, knew nothing of these developments. A surprise attack would make him easy to overthrow. Still, Henry Tudor remained skeptical. The entire scheme was supposed to save his life, yet it carried unfathomable risks. Welcome back to Lemmy History. This is episode 2 of 4 of my series dedicated to the conflict between Richard III and Henry VII. As always in my series, all episodes can be understood independently of each other. But of course, I'd be happy if you watch all the episodes. The so-called Buckingham Rebellion hardly deserves its name. Historians today largely agree on this point. In essence, it was a Beaufort-Woodville uprising into which the Duke inserted himself relatively late as little more than a symbolic figure. Contemporary sources do not portray Henry Stafford in a flattering light. Thomas More describes him as a narcissistic and somewhat foolish man, easily manipulated by Bishop John Morton. This account has often received great attention, since More had been Morton's student and thus had direct access to the man who was Buckingham's prisoner during the decisive week. Other chroniclers attribute religious motives to Stafford. The Croyland Chronicle, for example, presents him as a man who regrets his past conduct and wants to repent. According to this view, the murder of the princes in the Tower alienated him from Richard III. Some Tudor chroniclers accuse the Duke of acting out of financial interest, while still others suggest that he hoped to become king himself. What all these accounts share is a sense of uncertainty and strain. Even contemporaries struggled to make sense of the events that unfolded in the late summer and autumn of 1483. Too many actors moved simultaneously, often in ways that seemed to contradict their own interests. In London, most people hardly even knew who Henry Tudor was at that time. There was, however, one point of general agreement. The very fact that Henry Tudor emerged as a pretender indicated that those involved believed the princes in the Tower to be dead. Many historians continue to share this interpretation, though they reach sharply different conclusions from it. We will examine these debates in the following sections. For our purposes, though, it is crucial not to draw false certainty from this thesis. Not a single source states that all participants truly believed the princes were dead. Rather, it was a plausible assumption, one they were forced to operate with. This says nothing about whether the assumption was actually correct. For instance, one enduring theory holds that the Buckingham Rebellion itself may have sealed the prince's fate. This highlights one of the fundamental problems we face. The actors of the time lacked access to vast amounts of relevant information, and in this respect, we are no better off. This is precisely what makes the Buckingham Rebellion so tangled and difficult to reconstruct. Nonetheless, Charles Ross was right to call the uprising a key event in Richard's reign, for it revealed one truth beyond dispute. The Wars of the Roses were not over. They had merely paused for 12 years. The bloodshed was about to begin anew. After his coronation on the 6th of July 1483, Richard III had hoped for a very different sequence of events. Leaving London with his wife Anne, he set out on a progress through his kingdom. This decision has received mixed assessments. Ricardians point out that such a royal journey was by no means unusual. In summer, monarchs often withdrew to the countryside to avoid the heightened risk of plague in the major cities. Those less sympathetic to Richard note that the new king travelled north, his political stronghold. They argue that he may have feared uprisings against his rule. At the same time, rumours circulated that Elizabeth Woodville was doing everything in her power to send her daughters abroad. In response, Richard placed a man named John Nesfeld in command of the troops tasked with sealing Westminster hermetically. The former queen and her remaining children had been lodged there since the 1st of May 1483. This also meant that on the 6th of July they could hear the coronation festivities all too clearly, an experience that must have been deeply unpleasant. There may even have been an initial attempt to free the princes from the Tower that July, though if so, it failed. Yet the spirit of resistance among Richard's opponents remained unbroken. The Woodvilles planned their own uprising from the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey, drawing on members of Edward IV's household as well as their own retainers. Thomas Grey, who had escaped from sanctuary at the beginning of June 1483, undertook the necessary legwork. At first, he received support from Jane Shore, whom Richard had meanwhile imprisoned. Woodville loyalists concentrated primarily south of London. Their leader in Kent and Surrey was Richard Guildford, a close friend of the executed Anthony Woodville. In the southwest, in Exeter, Thomas St. Leger gathered supporters around him. Until her death in 1476, he had been married to Richard's sister, Anne of York. Margaret decided to rebel after the new king refused to allow her son's return, despite the fact that Edward IV had already granted permission. One of the wealthiest women in the realm, she intended to use her fortune to raise a mercenary army for Henry Tudor. His uncle Jasper Tudor was to accompany him. It was expected that some Lancastrian supporters would also join the venture. Moreover, Jasper still had loyal followers in Wales who would rise alongside him. Buckingham, meanwhile, was in Wales. He had met Richard in Gloucester at the end of July 1483 and then withdrawn to his castle at Brecon in early August. Morton, who had been under the Duke's supervision for more than a month, was also confined in the fortress. He soon gathered men around him within the castle. To all appearances, he was dissatisfied with his situation. The bitter truth remains, we still cannot fully understand the reason for this. For all we know, Buckingham had not lost Richard's favour. On the 15th of July, 1483, the king appointed his ally, Constable of England, a post Richard himself had held for 13 years. The monarch also made Buckingham the leading authority in Wales, effectively granting him the position previously held by Anthony Woodville. As late as the 16th of September, 1483, Richard, acting in the name of his son, the new Prince of Wales, instructed all local royal officials to report directly to Buckingham. Anthony, Baron Rivers, was not the only figure to whom contemporaries drew parallels. The Duke was also often compared to Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, who likewise served as a kingmaker before turning against the very monarch he had helped to power. Yet in Warwick's case, the reasons for his break with his king are far easier to identify than those surrounding Buckingham's estrangement. Edward Hall cites the so-called Bohun inheritance as the decisive cause, a claim echoed in earlier chronicles. Stafford was, in fact, entitled to this inheritance, but Edward IV had withheld it. Buckingham came from a family that had originally supported the House of Lancaster. Therefore, the first Yorkist king found it advantageous to retain the inheritance for himself. Richard had promised to restore it to Buckingham, but he now hesitated and sought Parliament's approval. If the inheritance truly alienated Stafford from the third Yorkist king, it may indicate that he doubted the monarch's sincerity or simply lost patience. Ricardians have long pointed out that Richard had not actually refused to grant the inheritance, casting doubt on this explanation. Another theoretical possibility is that Stafford learned Richard had ordered the murder of the princes in the Tower. Yet if that were true, we would expect him to have publicized such knowledge. Some Ricardians, in contrast, suggest that Buckingham was dissatisfied because Richard had not killed the princes, prompting Buckingham to do it himself, an act that allegedly cost him the king's affection and led to the rupture. In my view, a combination of factors is more plausible. Buckingham did not receive what he expected quickly enough, and he anticipated far more from a new regime. In the event of a restoration of Edward V, he might even have acted as regent, or perhaps even claimed the crown himself, should the princes indeed have been dead, and there were likely people around him who were more than willing to encourage such thoughts. Margaret Beaufort was undoubtedly one of them. She was, as far as we can tell, the first person to realize that several revolts against Richard III were being planned simultaneously. It made no sense for these efforts to remain uncoordinated. For Thomas Stanley's wife, the Woodvilles were initially the most important point of contact. Only they could grant legitimacy to her son. Richard, the de la Pole, the daughters of Edward IV, and even Edward Plantagenet and his sister Margaret all possessed greater perceived legitimacy than Tudor. Therefore, it was imperative for the Beauforts and the Tudors to be united by an indissoluble bond. It mattered little whether Edward V would be restored to the throne or everything would fall to Henry Tudor. Morton was the ideal intermediary. He had already conducted negotiations on precisely this issue. He knew his way around the court and was no stranger to Elizabeth Woodville. Unfortunately, he was still under Buckingham's supervision. By chance, however, an opportunity arose. Thomas Grey had not left England immediately after escaping sanctuary, but moved between various Woodville strongholds. He could seek out Buckingham and consult with Morton. To Richard's annoyance, this happened more or less openly under the eyes of his spies, and yet was not stopped. One theory suggests that the king allowed the conspirators to proceed in order to learn their plans. But since he was not informed until 11th October 1483 that Buckingham had joined the intrigues against him, this does not suggest that the monarch had the situation under control. Rather, Margaret Beaufort seems to have been pulling the strings. She was the figure in whom all information converged, and she decided what to share. Morton, now more of a trusted guest than a prisoner in Buckingham's castle, wasted little time. He urged Margaret to ally herself directly with Elizabeth Woodville. Her son must marry Elizabeth of York. Tudor forces on the continent would have to sail for England. Morton himself would secure Buckingham's complete support. Unfortunately, Thomas More's account ends precisely at the moment. Morton convinces Stafford to defect. Margaret had been in contact with the Queen during the early days of the Woodville's sanctuary through Jane Shore. But with the arrest of so many powerful men's mistresses, this channel of communication closed. Her physician, the Welshman Lewis Caerleon, now had to take over. As he also treated the Queen, he was allowed to pass through the tight cordon around Westminster and quietly smuggled letters back and forth. Physicians generally enjoyed access where few others were permitted. We need only recall that Domenico Mancini reports Edward V receiving visits in the Tower from his doctor, John Argentine. Argentine had likely treated him in Ludlow during his years as Prince of Wales. The family trusted him so much that Elizabeth of York later appointed him court physician to her firstborn son, Prince Arthur. The Woodvilles in Sanctuary agreed to the plan. We usually assume that Elizabeth Woodville made the decisions, at least after her brother Lionel Woodville and her eldest son Thomas Grey left Sanctuary in early June 1483. But I believe another figure now held the final say, Elizabeth of York. To explain, Edward IV had been head of the family until his death. This role then passed to Edward V, though in practice it was exercised by his uncle Richard, who was both regent and guardian. Within Sanctuary, the highest-ranking figure was now Richard of Shrewsbury. But given his age, he was unable to fulfill this role in any meaningful sense. Thus, the highest-ranking woman present assumed the responsibility of making crucial decisions. This was no longer Elizabeth Woodville. Instead, her eldest daughter Elizabeth of York, heiress to Edward IV, stepped into this position. This became even more true after Richard of Shrewsbury was removed from Sanctuary. Now, she was the person who would inherit the throne if anything happened to her brothers. There is much to suggest that Elizabeth Woodville played a leading role through experience, maternal instinct, and her considerable talent for survival. But the 17-year-old Elizabeth of York must not be overlooked. She was only 1 year younger than her father had been when he became king. She was the highest-ranking member of the family, and her influence quickly became apparent. In particular, members of her own household were to rise in rebellion. She herself was reportedly in direct correspondence with Henry Tudor, according to messengers who claimed to carry such letters. Without her consent, the alliance would have collapsed. It clearly did not, and this strongly suggests that Elizabeth of York supported the plan from an early stage. The anxious question now arising concerned the princes in the Tower. There may already have been a failed rescue attempt. Moreover, the Woodvilles and the Beauforts likely did not know precisely where the boys were being held within the fortress. We should recall Mancini, who merely reports that they had been withdrawn into the interior of the tower. This is commonly interpreted to mean the White Tower, yet such an assumption was far from absolute certainty. To make matters worse, Richard had dismissed the entire staff, caring for the princes at the beginning of July. It was no longer possible simply to ask a departing servant where the boys were. Because the princes had been removed from public view, even the number of guards who might have known their whereabouts had shrunk drastically. It is reasonable to assume that Margaret and Elizabeth attempted to map the tower as precisely as possible. Thomas Grey, who had been constable of the fortress until his escape, must have been an invaluable source of information. There were not many locations within the complex that required only a small guard presence while also remaining hidden from the public. The number of such locations was so small that a clear mood began to emerge on the streets, as Mancini reports. People were moved to tears whenever the princes were mentioned. They feared that their Uncle Richard had put them away. This need not be interpreted as a direct synonym for murdered, though the tears of the people certainly suggest that many believed the worst. Speculation regarding the possible dates of the princes' deaths is as wide as the sea. In Tallis, we find the evening of the 3rd of September 1483 as the proposed date of death, though allegedly they were seen practicing archery on Tower Green weeks later. Other historians, including myself, assume a much earlier death. I believe Edward V did not survive his reign. Though he officially ruled until the 25th of June, he was likely already dead by that date. Richard must have been utterly confident that he would face no danger from the executions of Rivers, Grey, and Vaughan carried out that same day. Be that as it may, the rebellion soon shifted focus from the princes in the Tower to Henry Tudor as its leading figure. Matthew Lewis gives us a revealing example of his lack of historical sense in this context. The former chairman of the Richard III Society claimed that Margaret Beaufort could not have known the boys were dead. Therefore, he concludes she must have lied to Elizabeth Woodville, unless she herself was responsible for their deaths. 3 points must be emphasized here. First, none of the letters exchanged at this time has survived. It is entirely possible that Margaret spoke only of rumors. Second, thanks to Mancini, we know with certainty that such speculations were circulating very early on. And third, all parties must have been aware that this special alliance was urgently needed, yet equally aware that betrayal was possible from any side. In fact, all factions would inevitably lie to one another in the long term. For the moment, however, this was secondary. What mattered was forging an alliance against Richard III now, and in this, they succeeded. We would like to know how Bishop Morton concretely convinced the Duke of Buckingham to change sides. 3 theories are commonly cited. First, he may have offered the prospect of a high post in the new government. This need not have been the kingship itself. If Edward V or his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, was still alive, a Lord Protector would have been required, a position that Buckingham could have filled. Secondly, Morton may have promised Buckingham a similarly prominent role under Henry VII if the princes were dead, or he might have given him serious hopes of becoming king himself should the other lines fail. After all, Buckingham was descended from Edward III in the female line via Thomas of Woodstock. Lands belonging to disempowered supporters of Richard's regime were also promised to Stafford without question. It should be noted, at least to preserve Buckingham's honour, that it cannot be completely ruled out that he learned of the prince's murder by Richard and therefore regretted his previous behaviour. The Croyland Chronicle in particular emphasises this possibility, yet I think we misjudge the situation to some extent. Within a few weeks, 3 separate conspiracies were to merge in secret, becoming strong enough together to overthrow the king. It is unlikely that any final agreements were made in advance. Rather, the parties promised everything to persuade others to cooperate. The details could be settled once the rebellion succeeded. The promise of a marriage between Elizabeth of York and Henry VII should also be understood in this context. The commitment could later be fulfilled. If Edward V had been rescued, he would have been head of the family and would have needed to consent to the marriage. Margaret Beaufort, however, preferred to rely on the king's daughter's name for political leverage. In their eyes, the dynastic significance of the marriage could wait. The original plan focused on the 18th of October, 1483. By then, it was clear the princes could not be saved. Buckingham therefore wrote to Tudor, urging him to come and claim his rights, carefully avoiding explicit mention of the crown. Implicitly, however, the idea of a King Henry was present and likely intended. Each recipient could interpret the letter according to their own perspective. On the 18th of October, the plan called for a revolt in Kent. More than the exact date, the crucial indication was that it was St. Luke's Day. In Kent, primarily Woodville loyalists were to take up arms to lure Richard south from London. Simultaneously, additional Woodville troops would march from the west, while Buckingham's men moved from Wales. Tudor would land in Devon with his mercenaries from the continent. Buckingham planned to cross the Severn and then arc northeast to strike Richard from behind. In this way, he could ideally cut off the king from reinforcements in the north and from Norfolk. In the conspirators' perfect scenario, Richard would be encircled, Buckingham's forces in the north, Woodville troops in the south, Tudor's army from the west, and to the east only water, for which he lacked the necessary equipment. In short, the plan would have been devastating for Richard if fully implemented. And this does not even mention that Buckingham's men could likely have reached Middleham to secure the king's son. At that time, Richard had relatively little in his favour. His biggest advantage was the wisdom of avoiding open battle during the English autumn. He was also aware of activity on the continent and had several cities and cargo sites secured as a precaution. Ironically, co-conspirators were often part of the commissions overseeing this work. What was meant as an advantage became a potential liability. Richard was enormously fortunate that his reign did not collapse within a few months. The first problem arose in the south, where the rebellion broke out 10 days earlier than planned. The men named Buckingham as their leader, but the other armies were not ready. Tudor had not yet embarked. Richard learned on the 11th of October that Buckingham's name was central to the uprising. The next day, he wrote to his Chancellor John Russell about Buckingham, calling him the untruest creature ever living, but adding that there had never been a more false traitor for whom we were better prepared. It is safe to say that Richard was furious. He sent Ralph de Ashton, Buckingham's deputy as Constable of England, to suppress the Kentish rebellion. Richard himself intended to confront Buckingham. In Leicester, he posted generous bounties on his head, remarkably including Stafford, Lionel Woodville, and Thomas Grey. Tudor was absent from the list, though Richard also promised rewards for the capture of other rebels. At this stage, the rebellion had not yet fully failed, only become much more difficult. Tudor and Buckingham could still have united and defeated Richard, but Tudor had yet to land in England. Buckingham was temporarily isolated and faced severe difficulties with the Welsh weather. A storm had destroyed the Severn Bridge he intended to use. The ground was waterlogged from continuous rain. Multiple attempts to cross the river without a bridge failed, causing losses and exhausting the troops. Richard pursued him, but must have realized that time alone worked in his favor. Eventually, desertions in Buckingham's ranks forced him to give up. His troops dispersed. Stafford himself sought refuge in Shropshire with a vassal named Ralph Bannister, who took him in at Laken Hall. However, Bannister betrayed the Duke to the local sheriff, who arrested him and transferred him to Salisbury, where Richard was stationed to eliminate the last remnants of the rebellion. Buckingham must have wondered, where was Henry Tudor with his 1,500 Breton mercenaries? Not even the commander of the troops knew for sure. The same storm that destroyed Severn Bridge had scattered the invasion fleet across the Channel. Tudor's ship eventually landed on the south coast, probably alone, with no clear idea of its exact location. He met apparently friendly soldiers who cheered him, claiming to be Buckingham's men and asserting that Richard was dead and Tudor had won. He could have disembarked and been celebrated as king. But Tudor shared a trait with Richard III, paranoia. If something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. Convinced it was a trap, he ordered his ship to return to Brittany. Soon, other English refugees confirmed that his caution had been justified. Richard's men had indeed intended to lure him into a deadly ambush. Had he disembarked, he would probably have been killed. This fate awaited Buckingham in Salisbury. He begged to speak to the king one last time, hoping to resolve misunderstandings and to name all participants. He claimed loyalty to Richard. The king, however, refused to meet him personally and had him beheaded on the 2nd of November. Under the Tudors, the Stafford family regained much of its old influence, though never permanently. Henry VIII eventually eliminated the Staffords as a political power. Buckingham may not have been the figure whom Richard most resented. That dubious distinction belonged to Thomas St. Leger, his former brother-in-law, still fighting in Exeter despite the rebellion's collapse. His actions earned recognition as a knight, but cost unnecessary lives, including his own. On the 13th of November, he was beheaded. These two were the most prominent casualties of the rebellion, demonstrating a key aspect of Richard's strategy. Over 500 leading Yorkists had escaped to the continent. Richard had won for the moment, but the core of his enemies remained strong enough to attempt a second uprising. He had to weaken it quickly. Thomas Grey, for instance, became a primary focus. Bringing him over to Richard's side would have severely weakened the exile movement. In this context, one decision continues to puzzle Ricardians. Why did Richard leave Margaret Beaufort alive? She lost her property and was placed under house arrest with her husband, Thomas Stanley, who had remained loyal to Richard during the rebellion and succeeded Buckingham as Constable of England. The king trusted his constable to keep Margaret under control and avoided making an enemy of Stanley by executing his wife. By keeping her alive, Richard retained a central hub of plotting under surveillance. Had he executed Margaret, he would have given his critics ammunition to brand him a tyrant. Elizabeth Woodville and her daughters were also spared. Their deaths would have confirmed suspicions regarding the princes in the Tower. Richard's strategy was clear: execute the rebellion's leaders while showing intelligent mercy to the women, thereby winning them to his side. Divide and rule. Henry Tudor understood the stakes. Upon his return, the worst-case scenario had materialized. The rebellion had consolidated Richard's rule. Key figures like Hastings and Buckingham were dead, while others, such as John Howard, remained loyal. Tudor had allies in exile, but resources were scarce. His mother was isolated. At Christmas 1483 in Rennes Cathedral, Henry made his first independent decision. According to most sources, he swore to marry Elizabeth of York. Subsequently, his followers and New Yorkist allies proclaimed him king. In Brittany, a kind of counter-court formed, and for a brief moment, Henry seemed to have turned defeat into victory. The joy following his oath was immense. Of course, he knew better. The coming months and years would be extremely difficult. He and his supporters would face the full force of Richard III's wrath. As always, thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe to help the channel.